right, Andy, thanks so much for being here. Excited to learn a little bit about your work in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, and across the country. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for a while now, but would love if you could just start by talking about your work, both with Let's Fix This and Let's Fix It in Oklahoma, and then the national work with NANR as well.
Yeah. So here in Oklahoma, Let's Fix This is or a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan, based around civic engagement. And we started in 2016 in response to, at the time, a really massive budget shortfall in the state budget that was resulting in really just across the board budget cuts. It was touching everybody's life in some way. And I worked in public health at the time, and a recognition that, things were going poorly, and I had never used my voice or done anything about it. I didn't know my elected officials, and it seemed pretty clear that they weren't sure what to do to solve the problem. And I thought, well, we should build relationships. Like, we should go to the Capitol and meet our state legislators and ask them, like, what are their plans, and tell them what we would be comfortable with, because we kind of all knew it would be around some sort of tax increase. Even small would be the solution, and politically, I know that's hard to do. And so we probably should go up there and tell them, like, hey, we're okay if you raise our taxes like $30. It's not a big deal if it saves the state. And so from doing that, I found out that there were, thousands of Oklahomans who cared deeply about their state and wanted to be involved, and didn't know where to start, and they didn't know how to get involved. And so we just started hosting regular Capitol days up there. And from that, I think collectively, as the organization grew and I got more involved, we started to, really have an interest in, like, how did we get here? How do we get these problems in the first place? Who made these decisions? How do they get elected? Who funded their campaigns? Like, you start pulling the thread to unravel politics. And kind of through that, realized that there was two big things. One, a big need, right? Of just someone, an organization or person, creating opportunities for the public to get involved in a way that had a very low barrier to entry. You didn't have to be an insider. You didn't have to know anything. You don't have to know where the door is. Like, we'll help you do everything to make it really easy and, like, accessible to everybody. Secondly, we need policy change, like, especially around democracy and elections, and the system, it seems, is askew in some way. And one of the, we in 2019 had a big policy platform about anti-gerrymandering, open primaries, ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform, a lot of those kind of policy issues. It seemed like, okay, these would solve a lot of problems. And I had the opportunity to start working on a ballot initiative around redistricting reform here in Oklahoma in 2019. And so I left my job in public health to go do that campaign full time as the campaign manager and spokesperson. And so we're doing that. We were making great progress. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we literally couldn't collect signatures because everyone was at home, like, bleaching their groceries or, whatever that phase of the pandemic. And but then still got to have all these conversations with people around the state and around the country around these issues. And around the same time, in 2020, I became aware of NANR, the National Association for Nonpartisan Reformers, and had met a number of the board members in their various issue areas, and just got lucky that the position at NANR came open late 2020, and I was able to join in early 2021. And so I still do that work in Oklahoma around democracy. And to kind of finish that piece, we also now convene a statewide civic engagement table of about a dozen nonprofit organizations from various issue areas, and kind of serve as, like, the backbone infrastructure for that community, helping provide, training, tech resources like voter file access, and, help using that to really try to, like, level up. There's a lot of infrastructure on the part of a lot of ballot initiative around redistricting reform here in Oklahoma in 2019. And so I left my job in public health to go do that campaign full time as the campaign manager and spokesperson. And so we're doing that. We were making great progress. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we literally couldn't collect signatures because everyone was at home like bleaching their groceries or whatever that phase of the pandemic. And but then still got to have all these conversations with people around the state and around the country around these issues. And around the same time, in 2020, I became aware of NANR, the National Association for Nonpartisan Reformers, and had met a number of the board members in their various issue areas, and um, just got lucky that the position at NANR came open late 2020, and I was able to join in early 2021. And so I still do that work in Oklahoma around democracy. And to kind of finish that piece, we also now convene a statewide civic engagement table of about a dozen nonprofit organizations from various issue areas, and kind of serve as like the backbone infrastructure for that community, helping provide, training, tech resources like voter file access, and help using that to really try to like level up. There's a lot of infrastructure on the partisan side of stuff, right? In the political parties in particular, and at least in Oklahoma, the nonpartisan nonprofit space was years behind. And so we're really trying to kind of build that up so that it's a bit more of a level playing field, I think, for organizations. And it just helps them scale to meet a growing need. And so we do that as well as continuing that kind of direct to the public engagement work. So over at NANR, it's a similar model, right? NANR is essentially a trade association for organizations, national organizations working on democracy issues and electoral reform. And so it's kind of the same style of work. It's a lot about convening the movement, bringing people together to identify areas of strategic alignment, creating economies of scale that benefit organizations, and similarly trying to build an infrastructure that is capable of addressing the need and to kind of push back against this two-party duopoly in a way that is a little more level-headed, or a little more level playing field.
Appreciate that. Let's tackle them one by one for a second, if that's all right. So,
Yeah.
thinking about Let's Fix This in Oklahoma, I've spent some time in Oklahoma, but I feel like when we talk about the pro-democracy community, I'm not sure how much people think of Oklahoma as a place where there's stuff happening or there's stuff that should be happening. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how do you think the work that you're leading is going in Oklahoma? You've talked about the receptivity of it, and I'm also curious. I mean, it's a red state. Oklahoma City might be a little different. How are you able to navigate both issues of partisanship and making sure that what is happening nationally doesn't necessarily filter into what's happening in Oklahoma? Because it seems like that can be a big challenge in this space too.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, Oklahoma is a majority Republican state by voter registration. We're about 50% Republican, 30% Democrat, and 20% Independent. Although the independents are growing very quickly, and in the next few years, 2, 3, 4 years, I think independents will surpass Democrats as the second largest voting bloc in the state. And
Hmm.
now at the elected level, at the state legislative level, it's not proportionate, right? It's the Republicans have a 80%, 80+% majority in both chambers. They control every statewide elected office. And so it really is a one-party state from that side. What's interesting is historically, Oklahoma was the exact opposite just about 30 years ago, right? So from statehood up until the early 2000s, the Democrats ruled Oklahoma, and they had also like an 80% supermajority in both chambers and controlled every statewide office. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, this shift occurred where the pendulum swung the other way. And so for folks who, feel like one party control is not ideal, maybe they don't like the party that's in the power now, a lot of them don't remember that the pendulum swings, right? That like it very well could swing back at some point. And I mean, history would say it will at some point. We just don't always
Mhm.
know when that is. Back at the voter level, Oklahoma's unique because we historically have, for the last several years, have had the lowest voter participation in the country, both in terms of the percent of our eligible population who are registered to vote and the percentage of those who are registered that actually turn out to vote. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's really, I think, disheartening when you see people complain, on social media or even in the newspaper about the state of affairs, and then you go look them up and they haven't voted in like 8 years or whatever. And so then you think, okay, well, there's a disconnect between voters' perception of what is happening and their belief that their voice matters or that they have agency to make a difference. And it's really exciting, I think, when you do work with people and you help them build those relationships or make those contacts where they start to understand that there's something else here that's not just about voting. And voting is super
Hmm.
important. And, you know, obviously one of the policy areas that is a problem here is having closed primaries where in a lot of the state, if you are not right now, if you're not a registered Republican, if you're a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian, you don't get to vote in primary elections, especially for like statewide offices and stuff. And so you get people elected in a primary if they don't have a challenger from another party, then they're elected in a closed primary where half or more than half of voters never had a chance to participate. And that kind of awareness then is pretty insidious on like undermining people's belief that this is a participatory democracy. They think those decisions are already made. And so, I think one of the things we try to do is really help people understand how the system works and find ways for them to utilize it or be active in it that are empowering to them as voters. For us, politically, to like thread that needle between partisanship, two things. Like we've always been pretty staunchly nonpartisan
Hmm.
with people from both parties on my board, and like we don't do any candidate work for obvious, like both IRS reasons and just like moral reasons.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
then um, we also, I think there's a disconnect in like the issues that are talked about, especially on cable news or in the media. When you talk about those same issues to individuals, they're often partisanized, right? Like a party will claim an issue as theirs. Um, for most people, it's not the same way. Like most people don't think about public schools or healthcare as being a partisan issue. They really just want things to work. And so there's this other disconnect that we're always helping navigate of like, how do we feel like what are the issues that are important to voters on the ground? And how is that different from what you might see or read in the media? And how can we, find ways together to more closely align the values of the voter, excuse me, the values of the voters with the values of those that are making those policy decisions?
When you think about, I mean, even the term pro democracy movement or pro democracy community, I'm curious because some of it seems like that there's some, just from conversations I have, some tension between like national organizations and what's happening at the local. And so the work you're obviously talking about is very place based. Is that the type of, like, when you think about what needs to happen or the state of the pro democracy movement, is it a focus on making sure that these issues are applicable to everyday life, or what do you think? I mean, I've sort of harped on the national for a bit, but I'm curious sort of what you see as some of the disconnect or the connection there.
Yeah. You know, I think, Scott, if we went out and knocked doors in Oklahoma and we just asked people what is democracy, um, I would imagine we would get, and I probably should do this to actually get the data, but I would imagine that
Hmm.
we would get a myriad of responses, most of which are based around just like voting. Like it's a place where you vote.
Hmm.
Like there's like a functionality aspect about it, as opposed to a moral or ethical or some even like an ideological basis. Um, and so I don't honestly I don't think that most people think about democracy ever, right? Like or
Yeah.
very, very rarely, right? I think there's like we're always trying to find the right word that connects with people so that they are on the same level with us, what we're trying to say. And sometimes I think we use democracy, we use civic health, but that feels academic in some way. And then, you know, living in, even feel like the word society feels increasingly academic, I guess, but like words like community, like everyone, it feels a little more wholesome and inclusive, and everyone kind of understands like this is our community and what it means to live in community with one another. But I think that the idea of community is usually divorced from an idea of democracy because one feels like a state of being and one feels like a action that we take occasionally. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
So give me the laydown of like what you think the state of those reforms are, knowing and that, it seems like a number of them. I mean, there were a few successes, but a lot of the state referendums didn't do great last November. Would love your take on what's working and what's not working there.
Yeah, so I think there's a few kind of takeaways. One, the electoral reform movement is relatively young still. That
Yeah.
field is relatively young, right? Like a lot of the groups started in like 2017, um, or since then at least. Now there was some Fair Vote's been around for 30 years. Like there's some people who've been working on it for a long time, but the movement really started like broadening, um, 7 or 8 years ago. And so there's still some like lessons that we're learning for the first time because it's still new, right? Um, one of them is we just haven't had enough time to like introduce and to help introduce ideas about reform to the public at large and allow the public sufficient enough time to like marinate on those ideas so they understand it. Like what we learned last year is that we were not beat by overwhelming opposition. We were
Hmm.
beat by mild skepticism, right? Like when you talk to
Hmm.
voters in focus groups about a policy, reform like open primaries, they're like, "Oh, that sounds great. I'm for it." I was like, "Well, how did you vote on it?" "Oh, I voted no because I didn't know who was behind it." And it's like voters' suspicion of just like, I'm afraid that someone's trying to pull one over on me, and just change is hard, right? Like a lot of people think that we've done primary elections this way forever, and we haven't. The modern primary started in the late 1960s, early 1970s, are really being adopted broadly, and so we haven't done it this way forever. But people are always a little skeptical for change. I think particularly in this like really divided environment where they are afraid that one way can make it better and the other way can make it really, really worse. And so they're just like, well, let's just keep things as they are until I know for sure which side this reform is on. Uh, and so I think moving forward, there's also the element of this last election that of having Donald Trump on the ballot and how
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
changes who turns out and the politics around the election. And so I think there'll be a lot of conversation about like needing like we need to do better or do more like base building and just like civic education at the local level and talking to people about the problems they see and helping them connect the dots, right? I as one example that I think supports this and also demonstrates what we should have done last year. uh the voters not politicians campaign in Michigan
Hmm.
with Katie Fahey a few years ago,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They did literally hundreds of town hall meetings, and Katie was great at connecting a problem, like connecting local problems, like the Flint water crisis, to gerrymandering, right? And saying like this problem exists because these politicians are unaccountable because they serve in districts that they drew, and and helping people understand that like because of this problem, it created this problem. And the closer that we can make that connection, then the stronger it is in voters' minds. And right now, a lot of reforms are more of an academic or intellectual exercise. People are like, oh, it's a good idea, but it's not for us because they don't see it as a problem in their local area. So once they start getting that more, then I think the sale is a little easier.
So do you think, appreciate that. So do you think that sort of means that there is a little bit of um slower pace on this stuff that needs to happen to do? I mean, I don't know. There's probably some strategizing that's going on right now. I'm just curious to what extent you're sort of saying we went a little too quick with some of these state reforms before the base building happens, or is it a different strategy element
Yeah, I mean,
too?
it's tough. Like, hindsight's always 2020, right? Before 2024, the we had really only had statewide campaigns in like one state at a time, maybe two states, right? And so to have seven all at once was a lot, which was super exciting. Um, but also sometimes I think we have to look at the data points that are decision points too, like the at what point do you decide to push a campaign in a state, and just be, sometimes you get all the things are lined up and it looks like it's going to be successful, and it's always really hard to tell like to what extent has this idea permeated on the ground. Like polling will tell you some, but not always the full picture. And so I think in a lot of the places that we lost last year, we lost really narrowly. And that might be just because of the unique candidates that were on the ballot that year,
Hmm.
coupled with, you know, maybe some tweaks to who our messengers are and what message they're delivering. Um, I think it is easy, it is easier to run, an airmail campaign where you do TV ads and direct mail, you get the message out to everybody. But if people can't call their friend or neighbor who's like politically involved and get their feedback, we need like more local validators. And that I think the only way to do that is time, right? Like just having
Hmm.
lots more conversations. So if it was in another 2 years, like if we ran those same campaigns in 2026, I think we'd have a very different outcome.
Hmm. But is there some pressure now within? I feel like one of the things that happens within the pro democracy space, not to project, but like
Yeah.
there is this sense of, you know, there are some folks that can overly focus on quote unquote silver bullet solutions or want the thing. And so it seems like the reform community is now in this place where it's, I think you're right in that it's young, but I mean, do you feel the pressure to demonstrate momentum, or how do you balance the like this is a thing that has legs with the also realizing that it's not a silver bullet solution, which you're not saying, but there's probably pressure to figure out.
Yeah, right. I mean, if we had won last year and even half the states, we'd all be a lot more comfortable
Yeah,
about
yeah,
what it looks like. But and when you talk to the campaign teams, right, like they all kind of know like at what point did things go like off to the side. Um, and because the rules for how ballot initiatives roll out state to state are so different, um, sometimes it's really hard to know, like even who's going to be on the ballot until just weeks or months before the election, and then it like changes the whole thing. Um, and so I mean, I think funders like to win. I mean, we all like to win, but like
yeah,
funders don't want to throw good
yeah,
money after bad. And I mean, what we really need to fund is like grassroots base building, right?
yeah.
Like collectively, the movement spent, I've heard, between 120 and 150 million dollars last year on all those campaigns. And if we'd spent that money, like even 10 million per state, we could have done 15 states, right? And fund if you spent $10 million on South Dakota or Idaho, like you could literally talk to every voter like 20 times, right? And like really invest in building this base, that makes it a much easier win. And in fact, in many places, might unlock a legislative victory somewhere rather than having to go to the ballot if you can build that much public support. But I think there's got to be like a balance there, and this is tough. I mean, everyone who runs a grassroots organization will say like we need more money at the base level, and we all know that's true. And it's hard to get folks to connect the dots. But long term,
But how do you get from point A to B, and how do you make sure that people don't feel alienated when you're telling them that structures need to be improved? I'm curious how you balance that.
yeah, I mean, I it's hard, right? I think part of the problem that we have is that we have really smart people that are telling voters like, here is the solution to your problems,
Yeah.
and voters don't like being talked to that way. Like even oh, like sure, you're a bunch of Harvard and Yale educated people. I'm sure you're smart, but like we don't need that here.
Hmm.
And, I mean, experts as a class have really taken a shellacking over the last couple of years, right, in America. I just had lunch with a scientist who runs a big building full of scientists, and she was like, "Well, like, we're all losing our
In
jobs."
the
Um,
NIH, yeah.
yeah, and so one of the things that we're trying in Oklahoma, because there's an open primaries effort in Oklahoma happening right now, and separate from it, but related to it, like part of what my organization is doing is doing like a bunch of local listening sessions around the state in small and medium cities that often get ignored, right? They just get mail or TV commercials, but don't have personal contacts. And just talking to voters and like listening, asking and listening to what is going on with them and like what their issues are, and asking them like, well, what solutions do you see? Because it's easy for us to come in and be like, oh, you got a problem? Here's a solution. But people kind of want to solve their own problems too, right? Like they want help,
Hmm.
but they often know what happens best. And in that conversation, there's also always space for some brainstorming together, um, and helping people maybe come a little bit closer to understanding like, yeah, so what you need is a new, water filtration plant. And okay, why don't you have that? There's not money. Well, why does, what does your state legislator say about it? Like here's, and it takes a little while to get there, but you can draw the lines of like, well, he's been running in close primaries and he's never had an opponent in the last 8 years, and he hasn't been delivering this for you that you need. Like, why not? And
Hmm.
helping say, like, you know, the way we elect people really incentivizes them to do what just these few people want, and helping people kind of understand that the system is designed in such a way that it incentivizes them to campaign and to govern in a certain way. And if we can change that, then it changes what's really driving them. And most people hate Congress, right? But like love their congressman, or they hate their legislature, but like their state legislator. And so like helping them understand that everyone's operating the system, and in those ways, like you don't really have to vilify any person. It's not like it's that
Hmm.
legislator's fault. He's a product of the system as well, and like what we need is a better system. Um, and so that's a longer conversation. It's not as quick, and you're not even really asking, you're not trying to ask them for a vote right then. You're just trying to meet them where they're at. Uh, and it's hard. I mean, that's, with our open primaries issue, we've got, a year and a half at least before it ends up on the ballot. And so we've got some time to have those conversations, hopefully a lot of them, hopefully more than once with each person. Um, but I think that kind of work is important. And that's really where, these like democracy or civic hubs and like these pro-democracy groups that aren't they're not selling a particular solution, right? They're just coming in to like build that community, to build the democracy that we are together, not just the one that we do occasionally. I think is really important, because people, especially in the broader environment where there are so many voices and people are increasingly unsure who to trust, um, being able to connect with their friends, their neighbors, their brothers and sisters, or whatever, to people that they know firsthand that they can trust. I think that's like the investment that will pay dividends for years in the future. It just takes that initial investment up front.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like I appreciate the point of experts, and it seems like part of the challenge here is that some of the structural reform work can be pretty easy to sort of demonize as these folks are trying to game your elections and decide who you're voting for, as opposed to giving you more choice,
Yeah.
which seems to like you actually have to do the deep work of explaining it, which it's easier when you don't have to for reforms.
Right. Well, and last year's election, both Republicans and Democrats were saying that democracy was on the ballot, and if you vote for the other guy, you're gonna, everything's gonna crumble apart. And then if you've got someone coming in being like, "We've got a solution for democracy," everyone's like, "I don't trust you either, man. Like this is too
Yeah.
much." And so just like let's leave it all alone, and like let's get through this election and figure stuff out. I can sympathize with voters who were there. Like they're not. It doesn't do any good to like talk down to voters like they're dumb. They're not. They're
Yeah.
doing what they think they need to do to keep life as unruffled as they can, just to like move forward.
What are you worried about, or what do you think some of the challenges in the field are right now?
I think if we don't learn from our lessons, right? Like we had a convening in December, we talked about all of this, and people were pretty transparent and honest about what went wrong. And if we don't fix that, then we'll commit the same errors again. And
Hmm.
then funders will really stop, right? Like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, kind of thing. Um, and so I think if we don't make efforts to be more strategic about those investments at the grassroots level, um, that would be a big error. Um, and the other, I think, growing problem is, and I don't have a solution to this yet, but for some democracy reform or electoral reform issues, political parties are trying to partisanize those issues too. Or one party says, we're opposed to ranked choice voting. Well, then the other party says, well, we're for it. And the people who are championing the reform are in the middle going, listen, like, we don't really like either one of you. Can you leave us alone, please? And if we don't find a way to combat the partisan arguments about it, if America continues down this like increasingly partisan divided path, then the reforms get caught up in that. And one of the powers, I think, of reform is that it is distinctly nonpartisan. This is generally systems that are designed to benefit this duopoly that we're trying to change. And if we can keep that space, then